Well, thanks for the pen. Appreciate it. So, I want to talk about D.H. Lawrence. You say, why are we doing D.H. Lawrence in the American diversity of religions class? Well, D.H. Lawrence, first of all, is buried, as I think I once told you, in New Mexico, at a place called Taos. If you've ever been to Taos, another ski resort to some extent. It's also an American Indian location. You have the Navajos there. No, not the Navajos. You have what are those groups of people that build the sort of buildings? What do they call those Indians there? No, what are they? Pueblos, yeah, Pueblos. That's not really an Indian name, that's a Spanish name, so I don't know what their tribal name is. Spanish called them Pueblos because they had house-like buildings or structures. You can see buildings like that if you go to Morocco. I've seen buildings like that on the way out of Marrakesh down through the Atlas Mountains to what they call the palmeries, where they have big palm roads going down the rivers to the Sahara Desert where the rivers just run out. But along the river palmeries they have buildings like those pueblos. I always wondered if people from Morocco ever sort of came over the Atlantic and got to Southwest Mexico and those places and came up. But it could just be an accidental resemblance. In any event, in Taos there's a big pueblo. In case you've never heard the name exactly, it's spelled like that. Now I've got a pen. So he's buried outside of Taos in a little, we call it a ranch, but it's not really a ranch, it's a little sort of well, I wouldn't call it a shack, but a wooden kind of structure, a little more than a shack, a little less than a house, out on a hillside outside north of Taos. And I recommend you visiting that if you go to New Mexico. There's a tomb there and everything. Because he lived there for a certain amount of time, and he was very inspired by Native American Indian sort of life. He wrote about the Hopi Indians, who one of the ceremonies they have is a snake dance there, where they put poisonous snakes into their mouths, and they don't eat them, but they don't kind of like chew on them, sort of, but they put them in their mouth during the dance. And I wouldn't put a poisonous snake in my mouth, okay? So I don't know what the deal is with that situation there with the, hey, you two, do me a favor, you guys, just go on outside and have your chat. We have a break. You can go out there and do your conversations, okay? Because we got plenty of time for breaks, and I'm not bothering about that. Anyway, he was very interested in the Hopi, who have a little reservation, if you've seen it, near the Navajo reservation, or inside the Navajo reservation. I told you about the Navajo reservation, that they got a very big area of land because Sherman, the Union general, really was very sympathetic when they came and asked him for a treaty and everything, and he thought they were very noble, and he was impressed by the way they carried themselves and approached him, and he gave them a huge area of land, which is probably the biggest Indian area of land in America. So all that, if you go to northern New Mexico, eastern Arizona, you can see all those sacred lands of various tribes that are quite populous out there. Still, and the pueblos and the jewelry being sold out there on the roads, you'll see it everywhere. So, but do go to D.H. Lawrence's so-called ranch. I don't think it was a ranch, just a house in a little hill area. He got that ranch because he gave the rich woman who was starting an artist colony out there. Her name was Mabel Dodge. Mabel Dodge. She was married to one of the Pueblo Indian chaps too, so she was called Mabel Dodge Lujan. But I think she was of the Dodge car family, which would make her fairly wealthy. I mean, I'm not sure if that's the connection, but I think it is. And she had a lot of clout in Bohemian, as they called it back in the late 19th, early 20th century circles. Bohemians, what you would call hippies or beatniks, but yeah. Bohemians were a little more sophisticated. They weren't like total losers, you know. They weren't just dropouts. They just they wanted to live a certain way of life, an artistic sort of, yeah.
Yeah, I heard that like they were forced to move around because like two countries were like fighting their.
Yeah, that may be one of the origins of the word, but Bohemian was applied to any arty sort of person back then. Anyone, but it's true, probably Bohemians moved around because they were
Russians.
Yeah, but they were also a little bit connected to gypsies too. So at that time, so it's all very. But that's not what the artistic people were. They weren't really from Bohemia. They were. That was just a word applied to them.
This group was moneyed.
Well, she would have. There would always be a patron who had money. You know, the individuals had no money, but you know, Bohemians always had someone who was shelling out money to support somebody. You had to have money. I mean, you know, they weren't living in communes, if that's what you mean. But people like James Joyce in English literature would be considered a Bohemian sort of person. Going back further, if you know French literature, the poet Baudelaire, that would be a Bohemian sort of person. André Gide, all the painters of the Impressionist period, they would all be called Bohemians. Toulouse-Lautrec. That's what a Bohemians were. So you can't call those people beatniks. You know, that's an American sort of more recent expression. Or hippies. They're more intellectual and more arty and more. They had some money occasionally. Yeah.
George O'Keeffe was one of them.
She'd be a Bohemian. Yeah, that's a very good example. George O'Keeffe, who came out and went to New Mexico to get her final inspiration for her paintings and things. Yeah. But she was originally hanging out in a Bohemian crowd in Greenwich Village in New York with famous photographers like Alfred Stieglitz and people like that. So she would be a Bohemian crowd in New York City before she went out to New Mexico also. But Lawrence got that house because he gave his manuscript copy of Lady Chatterley's Lover to Mabel Dodge, who had the big house inside of Towson. By the way, that house is still there. You know who owned it until recently, the house she had there in Towson? You know that guy, he's in a lot of movies, my memory is no good, but in Easy Rider, he wasn't Peter Fonda, but Peter Fonda's friend.
Dennis Hopper.
Yeah, Hopper, Dennis Hopper, right, thanks. He had that house for about 25 years, and he got fed up with it. I met his wife some years back in LA over a book signing that I was at and stuff, and it was obviously they were all living up in Hollywood now, so. So they're not out in Taos in Mexico, but he bought that house and was living there, I guess, after Easy Rider, and a lot of people would hang out there with him, I guess. It's a very big house. Now I think it's a convention center in the middle of Taos. Anyway, I don't know if you've been to Taos, but it's the old Spanish capital of what we now call New Mexico. That was the capital. Santa Fe, I don't think, was the capital. Taos was the actual capital. I think, anyway, maybe both were, but they were both not far from each other. Lady Chatterley's Lover, that's why we're really doing this person in this class. We don't read in this class Lady Chatterley's Lover. You say, well, what's Lady Chatterley's lover? Oh, well, let me see if I can explain it to you. Lady Chatterley's Lover would have been published in the 20s, and it was maybe 1925 or so. It's the reason you have all the pornographic movies, all the pornographic books, all the pornographic magazines that you presently enjoy. I mean, that broke the pornography line, because that book was banned everywhere. You couldn't, you weren't allowed to read it in America. You couldn't import it into America. As I think I told you, when we were traveling on the hippie backpack type road generation, we didn't smuggle, hash or pot into America. Things that we were smuggling, we would smuggle books into America. That's what we. So you'd take a copy of Lady Chatterley's Lover that'd be printed in Paris, and you'd put on a book cover, maybe like Peyton Place or something on the cover. I don't know what you put on the cover, but you put it in a different cover, and then you bring it in, because the customs inspectors were all looking for that kind of thing. They weren't looking for what they look for nowadays. That's what they were looking for, the banned books, like Henry Miller. And it was the case, I think it went up to the Supreme Court about Lady Chatterley's Lover that broke all of that.
Wasn't it Fanny Hill?
No, it was Lady Chatterley's Lover was before Fanny Hill.
Really?
Yeah, that was a later case for some reason. I don't know why that was.
Oh, there was, okay.
Fanny Hill was a much later case, I think. No, Lady Chatterley's Lover was in the 50s. That got broken. Late 50s. Anyway, it was also Joyce's Ulysses was also a problem because of Molly Bloom's soliloquy, if you know that work. I'm losing some of you. These are great works of English literature. But D.H. Lawrence was the person who was identified with this more than anyone else. And he brought about, if you want to call it, the sexual revolution, if you want to call it that. Not just because he was writing specifically about that sort of thing, but also that people were affected by it and it changed their outlook and so on. Now, I don't like D.H. Lawrence's novels very much, though. He's mostly famous as a novelist. How many of you have ever heard of D.H. Lawrence before this class? Yeah, about a third of you. That's a very poor sign. It's not your fault, it's a sign of the decay of modern culture. That's all I can tell you. Because you should have been taught this sort of stuff in grade school. And you need to come to college to hear about these things. But he was considered, he lived from around the 1880s. I think we have in your introduction, there'll be some sort of timeline for him. The 1880s, and I think he died around 1931 or so. I don't think he lived much past his mid-40s, early to mid-40s, huh? 46, was he? And he was very ill with tuberculosis. And tuberculosis was considered, it was called consumption in those days. It was considered the bohemian disease. I mean, just about almost all artists, writers had tuberculosis at some point or other. I think Chekhov had tuberculosis. I mean, it just was the disease everybody had. But he didn't get it because he was a bohemian. He got it because in England, coming from a, provincial place, the milk was always very suspect and tainted because it was easy from, I don't know how it worked, from the way cows were milked and so on before pasteurization, and that sort of thing was very widespread. To drink fresh milk from a milking situation, you could easily get, most people from farms had tuberculosis. It was I think even today they give patch tests in schools for tuberculosis, don't they? And a lot of people coming from other countries here are very, the health authorities here are very worried over that because of, the commonness of that disease. So he had it from a very young age. Because in England it was an endemic before the modern period. My wife would kill me if I said it, but her father had tuberculosis. And he came from a farm in Scotland. And, I knew him quite well, and he only had one lung by the time I knew him because they had operations by that time. But you know, he survived it, but he was in the generation that could survive it, and that would be in the period, I would say, of the 40s, 30s, 40s, and 50s after Lawrence. So by the 50s, people were surviving, but before that time, most people were dying of it. Lawrence died of it. That's what makes it so interesting, so vivid, because there's a dying man really writing this book that you're reading in Trusting Places. And really, how many have seen at least the movie Lady Chatterley's Lover if you haven't read the book? Yeah, that's no movies are any good as far as I'm concerned. But, no, the movie stinks, but you know, it's a movie anyway. You can get it out of the movie store. You're kidding me? Is it good? Well, where is there a good movie? That's only an occasional thing that happens. Okay. Anyway, what do you mean? Is she all naked and stripping in the movie and doing all this sex somersaults and things? No, I don't think so. Anyway, if you know the plot of D.H. Lawrence, of Lady Chatterley's Lover, if you've read the book, Sir Clifford, who is the wife of the husband of Lady Chatterley, is in a wheelchair. And he's supposed to be wounded from World War I, one of the walking wounded from that terrible war. And he's the owner of coal mines in central England and stuff like that. And his wife is still not yet ready to throw in the towel, shall we say. And he is not performing, okay, in that way, you get it? And the gamekeeper, who's keeping Clifford's estates, is able to perform in that way, you get it? And so the book is about the relationship of Lady Chatterley with the gamekeeper, going to his cottage on the estates and so on and so forth, and the sexual activity that occurs in that environment. And that was quite shocking to you. That's nothing now. I mean, just turn on the TV and all you do is see half the stages are porn, right? So, I mean, you know, that's nothing for you. That's like mild, I mean, soft porn maybe at the most. But that was considered so shocking back in the 30s and 40s that it created this sexual revolution situation. The success of that penetrating and breaking the bars for this kind of expression. I mean, you wouldn't have Playboy magazine, not that you should. You wouldn't have Playgirl. You wouldn't have all the spin-offs of that kind of Penthouse and so on. You wouldn't have any of those things. Those all appeared after these lawsuits. So, so Lawrence had, you know, indirectly or directly, a tremendous, you know, probably more influence than you could call him a prophet. And he's not a dirty old man like the publisher of Penthouse. He's a really explosive, visionary sort of writer. He has his own vision of life. And if you know anything, again, about that period, some of you do, some of you don't, he, I think he doesn't say it, but I think it's clear. A lot of people at that time were very influenced by Nietzsche. Now you say, who is Nietzsche? Not that I think it's so important to know. I can usually not spell his name, but today, because my friend gave me the pen, I'm in good shape, so I can put it up there correctly.
Is that S-C-H-E?
Z-S-C-H-E. Friedrich Nietzsche. He was influencing a lot of people in the 1880s, including Hitler, which is why he's not really thought very much about today by most people who don't like him. But he's not a Nazi, actually. some of his ideas could give rise to people who think in a Nazi-like fashion. But he was more of a romantic, visionary poet sort of person. He combined that with philosophy. It's the perversion of his ideas that become Nazism. For instance, his idea is what has come to be called in America the Superman. In fact, there wouldn't be any Superman comics without Nietzsche. That's a kind of joke on Nietzsche, Superman comics. His philosophical ideal is the Superman. And of course, we have the Nazi Superman and so on and so forth that grows out of all that. But he isn't thinking about that. He's really influenced by Darwin. Now, of course, you all know something or heard about Darwin if you haven't heard about Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is applying Darwin to philosophy. And he believes in this thing that in German is called Übermensch, which we translate into English as Superman. And that's the overman, some people would rather express it. In other words, it's the future man that man is developing, evolving towards, men and women. You know, the overman, in other words, he keeps saying man is a bridge between, you know, the Untermenschen and the Übermenschen. A lot of this goes into Nazi thought. Nazi thought, you know, just wants to speed this process up and center it around Nordic culture with a little Wagnerianism thrown in. That's really what Nazism is. A little Wagner, Nordic culture, you know, thrown in. You know, if you've ever seen the people who created Nazi, they're little dark, little misshapen, worm-like looking people, and they're all talking about blonde supermen and the master race. You know, they're all out of their minds. People out of a lunatic asylum. But that's what's so dangerous of people like Nietzsche to feed Nietzsche to, you know, little pathetic people. And that's what happened in Europe in the 1920s and the 1930s. But Nietzsche was also inspiring a lot of artists. James Joyce is totally Nietzschean, if you've ever read James Joyce. The whole end of Ulysses is Nietzschean. The affirmation, yes, 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 the artist who's going to create the meaning of the world. All that is part of Nietzschean philosophy, and these guys from the 1880s are all being influenced by that. If you've ever seen the movie Zorba the Greek, nobody has seen that movie, famous movie. Zorba is a Nietzschean character. It's only he's in Greek gods. Anyway, Lawrence is very influenced by Nietzsche, but he disagrees with Nietzsche. Nietzsche loved Greek civilization, and Lawrence abominates Greek civilization. He wants the pre-Greek civilization. He thinks before Greek civilization there was a more beautiful civilization. And he calls it, I guess, paganism or whatever you want to call it, but he thinks it isn't exactly the harmony or whatever that you get in the Greek civilization that goes into Christian civilization that both Nietzsche and Lawrence are very much against, but into something more beautiful is what he is striving towards. And this is what he expresses to you in Etruscan places. He puts this philosophy very strongly in Etruscan places. And you see, it's in his novels too, but it's particularly in a book like Etruscan Places that we're looking at. You say, you know, who would ever read Etruscan Places? Well, what have we to do with Etruscans? Well, the Etruscans were a civilization that were before the Greeks and the Romans. In fact, people think that the Etruscans gave birth to the Romans, and the Romans crushed the Etruscans, and that's how Lawrence starts the book, about how the Romans crushed the Etruscans and gave them a bad name. And we live in a Roman world as far as Lawrence is concerned. And that's one of the worst of all possible worlds as far as he's concerned. And I have to agree with him. I think that the Romans have gotten too good a rap in our day. And Hollywood movies still continue to give them a good rap. Movies like Gladiator and things like that, it makes the Romans look really interesting and important when they're really terribly barbaric and bloodthirsty. Pretty horrible. In any event, I think Lawrence has the right take on the Romans, and he'll express that to you in this very first sentence. The Etruscans, well, how does he put it here? I love his first sentence. It's one of the best first sentences in all of literature for expressing something quickly and easily. I think he says here, let's see. The Etruscans, as everyone knows, were the people who occupied the middle of Italy in early Roman days, and whom the Romans, in their usual neighborly fashion, wiped out entirely in order to make room for Rome with a very big R. Well, you can't get a better first sentence than that in any book, and that he just would write that off. I mean, with a very big R. And, you know, you're even laughing when I say it, but the point is that, you know, he's writing already tongue-in-cheek. That's sarcastic. I mean, he doesn't really like the Romans. He thinks they're horrid, they're horrendous. And he doesn't really think the Romans were, the Etruscans were this nasty little people who the Romans relieved us of. He thinks the Etruscans are wonderful. But he turns it all around in a sarcastic way and starts his book out like that and totally captivating. Well, that's the thing about Lawrence. He is probably one of the best natural writers you will ever encounter. And he proves it in little books like this. And his poetry is wonderful too. If you ever have a chance to read his poetry, I recommend it to you. It's not famous in the sense that, you know, rhymey, you know, ethereal, sort of beautiful sounding poetry is famous, but he writes in free verse also, just like Lawrence. He actually wrote a book about American literature, which is the best book about American literature I think anyone's ever written.
Maybe just like Whitman.
I'm just like Whitman. He wrote a book about American literature, which is probably the best book about American literature that anyone's ever written, called Sketches. I think it's called Sketches in Great American Literature. And it's about, you know, people like Fenimore Cooper, Whitman, Melville. He rescues a lot of these writers from obscurity and makes them really important. I think it's Sketches in Great American Literature or Famous American Literature, probably listed in the beginning of the book here. Let's see if I have it listed here. I don't think I see it right offhand. But in any case, I think Sketches in Classic American Literature. If you want to read a good book readable on American literature, read that. That is one of the best, most readable books that you can possibly read on American literature, and you'll know more than most of your instructors in this college. Don't say I said that. I take it all back. I never said it, and you can't quote me. Still, you'll know more than most of such people will know. Lawrence is a genius, and he's self-taught. He comes from a lower middle-class family in the Midlands of England. And let me finish one last point before I go back to where he comes from, and the Nietzsche thing and things like that. He not only is responsible for the sexual revolution, if you want to call it that we all now think as a given in our society, but he is, to some extent, probably one of the first real environmentalists. So between environmentalism and sexual revolution, we're dealing with a quasi-prophet here, not just a literary person. And in his prose, you can see that he's a prophetic, natural prophetic sort of person, a Whitman-like person, if you want to call him that. And he's proclaiming another sort of religion. The reason that I am treating him in his class is I think his writings are particularly important for what occurred in American culture. Even though he's not responsible for everything that occurred in American culture, still he has a great, triggering effect on lots of currents that are very much part of us in the present day. So if you don't think he's an environmentalist, I can give you another book that he wrote in Taos, New Mexico, called Reflections on the Death of a Porcupine. You know, there's not many people from his generation who would write a book called Reflections on the Death of a Porcupine. He went out and shot a porcupine on his property one night or morning, and he felt bad about it afterwards. And so he wrote a whole long essay, short book on that subject, and I think it's a great little book. I would use it in these classes if I had time. I don't have time. That was actually written in America, and he's got, for instance, poems called The Snake, about a snake he sees in his house in Sicily where he's living near Mount Vesuvius that goes into the water trough, a dangerous, poisonous looking snake, and he won't kill it. He won't touch it. He is in awe of it. And he writes this tribute to it. It starts off, a snake went into my water trough one day, or something like that. But it's an actually beautiful poem about his encounter with this snake as one of the, you know, masterful creatures of the earth that not only deserves his respect, but which he acknowledges as a, you know, fellow creature of regal proportions. Not something to be feared, but something to be in awe of and admire. So these kinds of things in his literature are, I think, what we would consider to become pre-environmentalist or totally environmentalist. So we have those two aspects of him, which is why I feel justified in reading him together with you people. And I prefer to read him than a lot of other duller subjects that one could think of. Plus, you're going to read a great writer. Now, that's the other point. That sentence I just told you about that starts off this Etruscan places, I'm sure he just wrote it out. He didn't blot it out. He didn't work at it. He didn't study it. He didn't, you know, write it over 10 times. These things just came right off the top of his head. He's a total natural writer. I'm sure this Etruscan places, he went home after visiting these locales. By the way, if you go to Italy and do some touring there, when I was your age, I hadn't read Etruscan places yet. And I was really stupid because I didn't go and visit these Etruscan places. You know, I went into all the boring places that people go to, church after church after church after church, museum after museum after museum after museum, and you're sick to death of everything in them. And because you think you're supposed to go to these places, and all the tourist buses, you know, pull up and they all tramp through these places like good little lemmings and follow the leader people and so on and so forth. Yeah, you do have to go to these places just to know you don't want to keep going to a lot of them. I mean, you have to, my wife said, what do you go to that movie for? I have to go just to know that I don't like it. You know, otherwise I'm an ignorant person. I said, after you watch that movie, I have to do it, I have to do it. I went to see Flags of Our Fathers the other day and I walked out after 45 minutes, so that was great. I knew it was a piece of junk and I walked out. You know? And fortunately the movie died, and I would have done the same with Borat if I had gone to see that one. And unfortunately that hasn't died yet, but so on and so forth. But, you know.
Why do you say that?
Huh?
Why do you say that?
I don't want to get into that digression. That's a long issue, you know, but that guy's exploiting certain things in an unjustified manner, but I don't really want to get into why. I think it's sad what he's doing, in fact. But really sad in many ways. But he's benefiting from it. And so. But, you know, I don't have to, as I said, you have to do these things, and I shouldn't speak about Borat because my kids saw it and told me, and they're admirers of him, and even for them it was too much to take what he was doing in that movie. But the point is that you should go and read things, even if you don't like them, just to know why you don't like a certain thing. You can't not like a thing if you haven't seen or read it. You know, that's really important to actually do that. In any event, to go back to where we were at, how do we get off that particular topic? This gentleman got me really into it, and I didn't want to go that far off. How do we get off into the reading things?
His background.
Yeah, what about it then?
You were telling us his background.
Yeah, I know. But what?
You're saying he wrote that sentence on the top of his head.
What?
You're talking about how he wrote that sentence.
Oh yeah, I hadn't read Etruscan Places yet. There you go. Thank you very much. That's where I wanted to get to. I hadn't read Etruscan Places yet. If I had, you know, that's what I'm talking about, going through museums and things like that. If I had read Etruscan Places, I would certainly have gone to visit these really interesting locales in central and northern Italy. You know, the whole Italy north of Rome, as he points out here, is really Etruscan. And that's why we call it what?
Tuscany?
Yeah, Tuscany. Tuscany is an English-Italian way of saying Etruscan. And all the arts and crafts and food, great wines, different foods, that Tuscany in artistic production of materials, clothing, fashion, art, and so on, that the Renaissance taking place in Tuscany and so on, that is known for, really comes out of Etruscan civilization. So under the Roman overlay that Lawrence considers brutal, is this earlier native culture, which he considers, maybe he's imagining it, splendid. And in his imagination, having visited the tombs and things of this civilization, he portrays what it is in this civilization that is splendid, and it is a religious message for us. Basically, it's the, well, I can't put it the way he can put it, which is why we'll have to read through it in a moment. But it's the quick sweep of life, I suppose you'd put it. I can't really, the vitality. And of course, a person who's dying of tuberculosis himself would feel that. I was telling you about Lady Chatterley's Lover and the plot and the effect it had. You see, Lawrence is both the person in the wheelchair, because he isn't functioning sexually anymore as a tuberculosis victim. And he's both the person in the wheelchair, so-called in American English, well, more English expression, being cuckolded, as they would refer to it, and the man doing the cuckolding, and the gamekeeper. The gamekeeper who he loves the gamekeeper, because the gamekeeper is his symbolic of the man in a state of nature person. That's why he's the gamekeeper. And he's virile and so on. And in this Etruscan Places, he's going to meet this old kind of man as he steps out of the primordial past. And he calls him in this book the fawn man. The fawn man, and the man, he says, who were killed off in the Great War, in the First World War. He says because they could not have survived such a war, their delicate sensitivity couldn't survive such a brutal war as that. And they were killed off in the last war. He's romanticizing, of course, but he's saying something very particular about his philosophy. So when he writes something like Lady Chatterley in 1926, he's really writing as both the person doing the sexual activity and the person who can't do the sexual activity. It's the early Lawrence versus the later Lawrence. So, I mean, that's why he can portray. And I met one of his mistresses or admirers when I first went to Taos. When I first came out here to California and started teaching at Cal State Long Beach, and I drove out to Taos, and she was there. Her name was Lady Dorothy Brett, her name was. And she was a painter and had been part of the Bohemian group that had gone out to Taos to be part of this a scene that was being sponsored out there by some of these rich American millionairesses and so on. She was still living there. She had followed him out there, and she did, in a moment of some intimacy in terms of discussion, say that, you know, he was impotent, that Lawrence was impotent, at least by that time, that he was going around with people like her. And he was also being cuckolded, if you want to use that word. Lawrence's wife was a very famous woman. Her name was Frida, but her last name was von Richthofen. If you know, she left her husband in England at the college that Lawrence went to. He was an English guy, was married to a German baroness. Her name was the von in Germany, a noblewoman. And her first cousin was, guess who? Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, right, the Red Baron. And So, you know, he married the first cousin of Manfred von Richthofen, the famous German fighter ace, but of course he hadn't become that, no, he hadn't become that ace yet, So Lawrence was under a cloud when they were living in England during World War I, having run off with Baroness von Richthofen, who was known by a different name because she was married to a guy I think called Meeks or Weeks or something at this college that Lawrence had gone to in, I think it was Nottingham Tech or something like that, just a German instructor. Well, don't come to my house and run off with my wife when I invite you to visit me as one of my students, but that's what Lawrence did to his professor, okay? She was a mother of 3 or 4 children, and too, but he had a magical effect. He was much younger, and he ran off with this woman. But when he was later living in all these places, he was really a real bohemian, first bohemian golf is in this book with a knapsack. And he had no money. He didn't need money in those days because it wasn't the modern jet transportation age to travel the world. And so he could live on very little money where in the places he went to with this woman who had left her whole family to be with him. But she was also pretty domineering, and in a later period when he was writing Lady Chatterley in Italy, she was carrying on an affair with the landlord, the owner of the building, an Italian chap who dressed in uniforms and obviously was something impressive to her from her old lifestyle. Anyway, they all went out to New Mexico together, and when he died, they brought his ashes back out to New Mexico. All of these women were all crazy about him, and there's a whole story about fighting at the railroad station in Santa Fe for the ashes and leaving the ashes behind. His wife, this woman that I told you about, Dorothy Brett and others. Anyway, they got finally put it in this tomb out in Taos. But the reason I'm telling you all this is that the wife finally married the man that she was carrying on an affair with in Italy at that time. And he came out of Taos, and he has all the rights to Lawrence's novels. I don't know if you see the irony. And then he's the one who prepared the tomb, and he made it almost like almost a Christian tomb when Lawrence was totally against anything like that. I can't remember what his name was. It'll come to me, but it's just ironic that that's how life works out. So I mean, he then went back to Italy after Lawrence's wife passed away, I guess, and I suppose his people in Italy are still benefiting from the royalties from Lawrence's books. So that's the way to lead your life, you know. Be careful, you guys, in your choices in life, and you won't get in that kind of trouble. So, to go back to his early life. He didn't have any of his own children because of the situation that I described. His father was a coal miner, and his mother spoiled him to death and loved him, and so she didn't want him to go into the mines in Nottingham. And he recites how he used to see his father dirty, come back from the mines. He might have had black lung or something like that. And his mother made sure that he went to school and studied and did things like that. And all that is described in a famous novel of his called Sons and Lovers. How many have heard of that novel? That's his first great novel, and it is a great novel. And it's autobiographical. It's about his mother, his first girlfriend, his father, his whole life in Nottingham, and so on. So he got famous pretty early. He went to this teacher's college, something like Long Beach State was in his first embodiment. And that's all he did. He did, I think, 2 years of teacher's college, and that was it. And that's not in England considered a very sophisticated education. But he then was a school teacher for a while, and he started writing these novels, and then he took off and ran away with his German countess and lived a bohemian life in different places, in Italy mainly, and then in America. But he also loved Mexico. And he wrote a book called Mornings in Mexico, which is an interesting group of essays about life. He's one of the first persons that put Mexico on the map as a literary place, liked to travel and write about it. And he then wrote another book, a novel about Mexico, incorporating a lot of these themes called The Plumed Serpent, which is Quetzalcoatl, the god in Mexico. And then he wrote a novel about Australia called Kangaroo. He wrote novels about every place he went, just about. But as I said, his most interesting work, he wrote a lot of sexual novels. I think one is called The Rainbow. And the other is called Women in Love. They've made some movies out of both of those. You can get them. They're very, very good. Now, those are good movies. Women in Love. Yeah, they are really good movies. Lady Chatterley is a crummy movie. But Women in Love and The Rainbow, I think, were both made into movies. At least Women in Love I know was, and they're really good. And they're very good novels. They're very advanced for their time. And so, okay, I still think his essays are the best, and we get his religious ideas in his essays. So without talking more about him, now you know his whole life, I've sketched it out somewhat. Let us look at this work and see what's good about it and see what we can pull out of it in the next period, or the rest of this period and the beginning of next half of next time. We'll try to finish it up by halfway through next time, and then save the chosen for the second part of next time and the last time. Hopefully that's the way we'll go. Look at the first sentence here. I hope you have it. The Etruscans, as everyone knows, were the people who occupied the middle of Italy in early Roman days, and whom the Romans, in their usual neighborly fashion, wiped out entirely in order to make room for Rome with a very big army. That's a really great sentence. But look, they couldn't have wiped them all out. There were too many of them. But they did wipe out the Etruscan existence as a nation and a people. However, this seems to be the inevitable result of expansion with a big E, which is the sole raison d'etre. Raison d'etre means reason for being, French, which is the sole raison d'etre of people like the Romans. So, does he like the Romans? No, he despises the Romans. And what's their sole raison d'etre? Expansion with a very big E. Okay? This is written in the 1920s, around the time that Hitler is rising in Germany and Mussolini is rising in Italy. And he refers to these coming fascist sort of groups in this book occasionally. He calls them fascist police louts. He hates them. And there's nothing, you see, these people, Nietzsche, Lawrence, there's nothing fascist in these people. They're just bohemian, highly sensitive, artist-minded types, and they think that the artist, Joyce too, should create the meaning, as Joyce puts it in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. If you've read that book, James Joyce, great book, read it if you have a chance. You know, I want to create the uncreated conscience of my race, meaning the Irish race. That's what his task in life is, to do, to create the uncreated conscience of his people. It's totally Nietzschean, what he's trying to do in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And in Ulysses, if you've read it, I don't like Ulysses as a book, but Portrait of the Artist is approachable, is a book you can read, and is really a really interesting book of that genre and a great work of literature. Now, what we know nothing about the Etruscans except what we find in the tombs. Now, I was telling you about visiting things in Italy. After you get tired of going to all the museums and all the churches, which basically start to repeat themselves, they're the same statues, same everything, until you get kind of sick of them. Same in France. Then you might go to some other interesting places too. And one of those places to go is the Etruscan places. Do go if you have a chance. I said I didn't go when I was your age, when I could have done, because I was still on the tourist circuit and didn't know that such things existed. No one told me about them. I hadn't read this book. But he starts off here in a place called Civeteri, perhaps Cerveteri. I think it's Civeteri, but I just call it Cerveteri. It's easier off my lips. Excuse me if I pronounce it wrong. I like it better like that. Anyway, C-E in Italian is ch. It's not s. In case you are wondering why you say ch. In Civeteri or Cerveteri, there are these mounds. Now, I used to assign this book here. Some of you have it, don't you? This is a great one because it has the pictures in it. Whereas for some reason they stopped printing this book. So I don't know how many have this book and how many just have a little big fat collected DX. How many have this book? Everybody have this book? Oh, well, you're lucky. Because you've got the pictures. Because some of I didn't know it was still in print. Obviously, it's been reprinted, and that's really a good thing. Because if you want to see the mounds, You can open up there to those pages there. It's a very bad photo, but I've been to those places. It's on the coast outside of Rome. In fact, you can go up on the highway to the coast, and pretty soon you see just what he's seeing in this book here, Ladispoli, Ladispli, and he talks about that. That's the train station I think he goes to where he has to walk from to see these places. Now you just drive your car or so to them. And there are these, as he said, the only thing the Etruscans left were tombs, because everything above ground was made of wood and stuff like that, and it evaporated. But everything below ground, or the tombs, were made out of stone, and they remain. So not only do you have these, what he calls them as tumuli. You see there tumuli here? These are very old pictures, and then you see the inside of the tumuli here in your book, and so on. This book I got at some point in Italy when they were printing it there, and I got a lot of old pictures in here. You probably can't see it, but I don't know if I have better pictures of the tumuli than you do. I think I do. Oh yeah, there's a great picture of the tumuli. It's a big round mound with grass and stuff growing around it and trees. And today, I've been there, and there's even more trees growing around in these sort of sacred spots. It's more grown up with vegetation. And he says it's really good for the soul to be in these places. Well, if you stand in that place, and very few tourists go there, occasionally a tourist bus comes and inundates the place, and they will run and leave. But if you go there by yourself, I mean, you feel a quiet stillness there that is really quite indescribable. So I think he's quite right about the effect of these places. So now that I've told you about them, if you go to Rome, you make your tourist guide or your rented car or whatever you do, take you out to this place, Civetri, that no one will go to, and you won't be sorry. Because it's well worth, it's certainly better than going to some of the churches you're going to see, that's for sure. And then further up the road, maybe 50 miles further north, getting towards more into Tuscany, you come to this place called Tarquina. Tarquina. Most of his book is, I think it's maybe is it IA or just A? The Painted Tombs of Tarquinia, yeah, IA. Which is another town about, as I said, 50 miles further north from Civetri. And he spends most of the book talking about those tombs. And in your book, fortunately, and I've got more pictures in this book here, but you actually, lucky as you are for this book, even though the pictures are crappy, you've got pictures of the tombs that he's describing. You can't tell much from these pictures because they're so ugly, these pictures, in terms of the photography. But those tomb paintings are still there. Unfortunately, now, because of his books and others, in his day nobody even went to visit them all. He said you could smell there was urine and, you know, cat urine and stuff or whatever. Nowadays, they've got lights that go on. They're shielded behind bulletproof glass. You punch a button and you hear this huge sound goes on, and the lights come on, and they've totally ruined these places. They're just like totally, I mean, they're protected, but you can't get any feeling of the natural splendor of the place at all. That's because people would have disfigured them and ruined them and done all this stuff to them now that they've gotten more popular and so on, so they probably had to do something like that, but they've done such an awful job that they destroyed the splendor of the place. So I can't promise you that it's be inspiring to see the Tarquinia paintings, but you can get an idea of the Tarquinia paintings from the books that you have there. And actually, you see, I have in this book some actual color pictures of them. And there they are more splendid. You can see the colored pictures there. This is called the tomb of hunting and fishing with the birds and the fishermen and the porpoises jumping out of the water, all the natural life that he admired, and the wrestlers here and so on who are wrestling. And let's see what else we have here. I don't know if I have any other good colored pictures like that. They're expensive. Let's see. Looks like I just skipped over one here. Ah, here, come on. Nah, there's nothing. That's not a very good one. I can't see. I guess I showed you, but that's not. This is inside of Chivetri. You can't really see much. But that is a great picture, the one of the hunting and fishing tomb there in the color. Here's some more good ones. And that's before they put the glass in front of them and ruined them totally. You know, so as you go into these tombs now, they're not as handsome as they were then. So what's he doing here? He's walking through these tombs, and he's talking and writing about them, and in the process bringing them to life and explaining his philosophy of life, which is something of what I was talking about: sexuality, the quick pulse of life, the natural rhythm. The things that we all admire today, really. Things that people today actually like and are unable to express. So he's extremely modern. And so I'm going to read them to you a bit, because this is really a religious book and a religious philosophy. And it incorporates the aspects of that I say that he's really known for. So, now, we know nothing about Etruscans. I think it's your page 9, is it? Except what we find in their tombs. There are references to them in Latin, but of first-hand knowledge we have nothing except what the tombs offer. This is really good prose. Almost like Whitman, but even better as prose. So to the tombs we must go. Or the museums containing the things that have been rifled from the tombs. So does he like museums? Not really. He already puts them down by saying they contain the things that have been rifled from the tombs. But we know his attitude just from that little sentence. Myself, you see, he says, the first time I consciously saw Etruscan things in the Museum of Perugia, I was instinctively attracted to them. And it seems to be that way. I'm not going to read this whole book, don't worry. I want to get you into it though. Either there is instant sympathy or instant contempt and indifference. Most people despise everything BC that isn't Greek. This is the idea I told you about. That's what most people do think. Even I think that. For the good reason that it ought to be Greek. If it isn't, that's great. I'll read that again. Most people despise everything BC that isn't Greek for the good reason that it ought to be Greek if it isn't. Which is, it's so easy, so facile, so easily written. So Etruscan things are put down, even a modern expression like put down, as a feeble Greco-Roman imitation. And a great scientific historian from his time, like a person called Mumpson, hardly allows that Etruscans existed at all. And this is lovely. Their existence was antipathetic to him. Antipathetic. What does that mean, antipathetic? The opposite of sympathetic. They antagonized him. They were antipathetic to him. You can hear the sarcasm in his voice for academics. The Prussian, the German. The Prussian, oh yes, I have a handout for you to sign. Hold on, you're sitting on here. Let me get this around for you all run away and we end this class. Hold on, I give you the sign-up sheet. I see you getting nervous here. Put the date on there and start it going, okay? Hurry up, move it quick, because they all want to leave. I know what you're doing. The Prussian in him, the German Nazi if you want, was enthralled by the Prussian and the all-conquering Romans. So being a great scientific historian, that's in his period, he almost denies the very existence of the Etruscan people. He didn't like the idea of them. You see, this is great prose. Look how easily you can read it. This is not a boring essay. This is really an exciting essay. That was enough for a great scientific historian, and he dismisses it. That was enough for a great scientific historian like Mumpson, whoever he is. Besides, look at this great prose. The Etruscans were vicious. We know it. because their enemies and exterminators said so. That's also great stuff. Just as we knew the unspeakable deaths of our enemies in the late war, who isn't vicious to his enemy, to my detractors I am the very effigy of vice, à la bonheur. What does that mean, à la bonheur? Good luck to you, toast to you, à la bonheur. Yeah, sure, right, à la bonheur. Good. However, those pure, clean-living, sweet-souled Romans who smashed nation after nation and crushed the free soul in people after people and were ruled by Messalina and Heliogabalus and such like snowdrops, they said the Etruscans were vicious. So basta. Basta enough. So it is. The Italian. Con le maître parle, tout le monde se tait. When the master speaks, everyone pays attention. Do you ever remember those ads about E.F. Hutton? They're talking about the stockbroker, E.F. Hutton, and the guy says, oh, when E.F. Hutton speaks, everyone is listening to the stockbroker type thing, and the whole room turns. And it's like, when the master speaks, everyone must listen. The Etruscans were vicious. The only vicious people on the face of the earth, presumably. You and I, dear reader, we are two unsullied snowflakes, aren't we? We have every right to judge. Myself, however, if the Etruscans were vicious, I'm glad they were. To the Puritan, and here he starts announcing his philosophy, all things are impure, as somebody says, and those naughty neighbors of the Romans at least escaped being Puritans. So now we're seeing what it is in the Etruscans he loves, And the Romans were a bit, though they were totally corrupt and, vice-ridden, they admired virtue, supposedly, and they were somewhat puritanical in their view of things. But to the tombs! On a sunny April morning, we set out for the tombs. I want to keep you 5 or 10 more minutes. I don't think you're jumping up here. From Rome, the eternal city, now in the black bonnet. Why is Rome in a black bonnet? Mussolini, fascism. The brown shirts, the black shirts. It was not far to go, about 20 miles over the Campagna towards the sea and the line to Pisa. The Campagna with its green spread of growing wheat is almost humid again, but still there. Now, the other thing you get in Lawrence is flower sensitivity. He is really, if you like, the first flower child on the literary record. He is a natural affinity for flowers. Now, as a man, we men look down on men who like flowers, that seems fruity to us. But the women in the room will appreciate that sensitivity in a man, and I'm sure they will respond very positively to that aspect of Lawrence, and they won't consider him a fruit. They'll consider him actually an extremely sensitive, charming, masculine person. And that's the thing about Lawrence. If you were going to take a walk with anyone that you have read this year or read in other places, you probably wouldn't find a better person to take a walk with than Lawrence. It would be a really invigorating, inspiring, exciting experience. Whitman, he might start to sweat and smother you with dirty kisses or stuff like that. Or he might smell his armpits or whatever, You probably wouldn't want to take a walk with Whitman or anything like that, But Lawrence would be really totally charming. And that's the thing is, he shows men as sensitive beings. You don't have to be totally unmasculine to be a sensitive being, because Lawrence is a very masculine person. But he's also sensitive. So he's not sort of yob from the sports bar or from the locker room snapping his towel at somebody or, whooping it up, in the sports bar for the latest pro football or whatever happened, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He is somebody with a flower sensitivity. So watch that as you read and see, look, the first flower sensitivity he shows here is the next paragraph. The Campagna, which is an area of flat land outside of Rome, with its great green of growing wheat, is almost humid again. But still there are damp, empty tracts, where now the little narcissus stands in clumps or covers whole fields. And there are places green and foam white, all with chamomile. And on a sunny morning in early April. Now, look, you guys, and probably a lot of you girls or women in this classroom, don't even probably know what a narcissus is. I don't know what a narcissus is. If you showed me, I wouldn't know a narcissus from an iris. And I wouldn't know what chamomile looked like either. He knows the names of all the flowers. And he knows, exactly what they are, and I think there are some women in this class who probably do know that, but I'll bet there's almost no men in this class who know these things. And now you're looking, I don't know them either. But I have to admire him, because he does know these things. And that's what's so impressive. And, he's from the coal mines in central England. He's totally self-taught, self-educated. And he's probably one of the most civilized, sophisticated persons that you'll bump into, and he's not a sex maniac, regardless of how that might be portrayed. We're going to Cerveteri, which was the ancient Ceri, or Seri, and which had a Greek name too, Argila, and it was a gay, gaudy Etruscan city when Rome put up her first few hovels, probably. Anyhow, there are tombs there now. So now he talks about his trip there, and he's trying to get to there on the railroad. It's only 8.5 kilometers away, about 5 miles, but there's no way to get there. Only a post omnibus. What would a post omnibus be? It would be a bus that took the mail in the morning and came back in the evening. He calls it a post omnibus. We arrive at Palo, a station in the middle of nowhere, and ask if there is a bus to Cerveteri. No, an ancient sort of wagon with an ancient white horse stands outside. Where does that go? To Ladispoli. I told you Ladispoli. If you take the freeway out of Rome, you'll see the sign, Ladispoli. We know we won't go to Ladispoli, so we stare at the landscape. Could we get a carriage? It would be difficult. All the people in Italy always say, difficile. It would be difficult. Difficile. And that's what everyone always tells him. This is why, what they always say, difficile, difficult, meaning impossible. At least they won't lift a finger to help. Is there a hotel in Cerveteri? They don't know. None of them ever been there, though it's only 5 miles away. And there are tombs. Well, we leave our 2 bags at the station, but they cannot accept them because they're not locked. But when did a holdall, meaning a rucksack, ever have a lock? Difficult. Well then, let us leave them and steal if you want to. Impossible. Such a moral responsibility. Impossible to even unlock small shoulder bag or holdall at the station. So much for officials. Anyway, they find a little man at the little buffet who's willing to put them behind the bar, and they go off to walk to the tombs, which is 8 kilometers, 5.5 miles. A flat road with rather noble avenue of umbrella pines for the first few yards. A road not far from the sea, a bare, flattish, hot white road with nothing but a tilted oxen wagon. And beside the road, and here are the flowers. Do you know what these are? The tall asphodel is letting off its spasmodic pink sparks, rather random and smelling of cats. Away to the left is the Mediterranean, gleaming, glistening flat and deadish, etc., 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 etc. Well, what is that scene at the railroad station? What happens there? He shows his contempt for these people. Always, you ever been traveling? You ask a question to a guy, whether it's in Mexico or some other place, Europe or whatever. Can we do this? No, not possible, not possible. Everyone is always saying, no, it's not possible. And yet, if you push on, it is possible. No, we can't take your bag. Sorry, we can't take your bag. It's not locked. Too great a responsibility, and so on. But then you find someone at the bar, the coffee bar, or something who's willing to put it behind the bar, and he doesn't care if they steal out of his bag anyway. Because where does he want to go? He wants to go to the tombs. Anyway, they get to this town. I'll let you go in a second. Just look here in this paragraph here. They come, we pass through the gateway where men are lounging, talking, and mules are tied up. This is the old world. And we see the notice, vini and cucina. Wines and kitchen, cucina. It's cucina. But it's only a deep cavern. We ask the man who's cleaning the post omnibus in the street if there's any other place. He says no. So we go into this cavern down a few steps. Everybody is perfectly friendly, but the food is as usual, meat broth. Anyway, he describes the food. Then he says, in the cavern swaggers a spurred shepherd, wearing goatskin trousers with the long, rusty brown goat's hair hanging shaggy from his legs. He grins and drinks wine, and immediately one sees again the shaggy-legged fawn. His face is a fawn face, not deadened by morals. That's Nietzsche, who wrote a book, Beyond Good and Evil. He grins quietly and talks very subduedly, shyly to the fellow who draws the wine from the barrels. It's obviously fawns are shy, very shy, especially of moderns like ourselves. He glances at us from a corner of his eye, ducks, wipes his mouth on the back of his hand, and is gone, climbing with his hairy legs onto his lean pony, swirling, rattling away with a neat little clatter of hoofs under the ramparts and away to the open. He is the fawn, escaping again out of the city precincts, far more shy and evanescent than any Christian virgin. You cannot hard-boil him. He sees these modern women, I'm sorry to tell you, as hard-boiled, tough, very, very hard. And he's looking for something else. He talks later on about modern women here in the next paragraph. I know a handsome fellow of my own age, 40 and a bit, is quiet, queer, remorse, crushed between war memories that have revived and remorseless go-ahead women folk, etc., etc., etc. Well, that's his personal prejudice. But anyway, this is how he starts this, this essay book little thing, and then he goes into the tombs and starts describing the tombs. The next time, we'll look at the tombs with him. I hope you will meet it before me. Just want to get you into it. Thanks for big patience. You know, we professors, we should earn our salaries. We shouldn't be lazy and let you go earlier. Really? You miss me? That's a compliment. I miss you all. Students here are great. I love the students at Cal State Long Beach. Great students here, and great university, very sort of mediocre faculty and administration. But that's the same for all institutions.
I'm hoping that I'm not in the
It's the same for all institutions.
the way you put it out, there's no idea.
No,
I think 11.
you have to live it. You have to live it.
Walk together?
Yeah, that's what I
The
asked.
school I've been to, it's totally inspired.
Well, that's kind of say. Oh, you like Lawrence then? It's pretty good stuff.
Elvira's been driving me tonight.
What you got here? Your
Oh, I can't park up there.
What's this? Oh,
No, because I teach. And,
thanks anyway.
and when he came up and gave me
Oh,
his...
did you get it then?
Huh?
Did you
Oh,
get
no,
it
no,
back?
no. He found one in the other room, and I was about to give you mine.
I wish I'd had it earlier. What's the matter? You got a headache?
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's very
Okay. Okay. Almost, you won't have